If you stood on the gravel of that Marsh Harbor boatyard in the dead of winter, looking out at the black expanse of the Sea of Abaco, the first thing that would strike you is the light. The boatyard does not just exist in the dark, it cuts through it with a stadium-like brilliance, an artificial beacon of industrial floodlights that bounces off the white hulls of docked yachts and casts long, sharp shadows across the concrete. For months, the man sitting in the small guard shack behind those gates was just a silent witness to the geography of a tragedy. A night watchman named Edward Smith who saw the dawn break on a story that would soon captivate and horrify millions. But when investigators finally sat down with a transcript of what Smith observed in those first terrifying hours after Brian Hooker stumbled out of the sea, the artificial light of that boatyard suddenly illuminated something far more sinister than anyone had prepared for. It was the moment the carefully constructed timeline of a grieving husband did not just fracture. It completely shattered against the cold, unyielding testimony of a man who had no reason to lie. Think about that for a moment, because what the night watchman saw, and more importantly, what Brian Hooker told him while dripping wet and begging for water, changes absolutely everything we thought we knew about the final hours of Lynette Hooker. It turns out that before the lawyers were called, before the international media descended on the Bahamas, and before the official statements were filed with the Royal Bahamas Police Force, there was a raw, unfiltered conversation in the pitch black of 4 o'clock in the morning. And in that conversation, Brian Hooker allegedly dropped a detail so deeply alarming, so entirely contradictory to his later narrative, that it fundamentally alters the legal landscape of this entire investigation. To truly understand the weight of what has just been exposed, we have to look closely at the mechanics of the story Brian Hooker would later tell the world, a story that relied on the cover of absolute darkness and the mercy of an unpredictable current. The official narrative painted a picture of a sudden, catastrophic accident occurring around 8 o'clock in the evening, a time when the tropical night falls over the islands like a heavy velvet curtain, rendering the ocean a black abyss where a person could vanish in the blink of an eye. Brian claimed that the visibility was virtually non-existent, that the 2 to 4 foot seas were tossing their small dinghy violently, and that once Lynette slipped off the back into the roiling water, she was instantly swallowed by the tide. But when Edward Smith opened the door of his watch shack to find a man claiming his wife was lost at sea, the time of the incident shifted backward in a way that defies all logical explanation. According to the watchman's fresh testimony, Brian did not say his wife fell into the ocean at 8 o'clock under the cover of total darkness. He explicitly stated that the calamity occurred around 7 o'clock in the evening. Stay with me here, because this is where it gets incredibly complicated, and this is where things get serious for anyone attempting to defend the timeline of that night. At 7 o'clock in the evening during that specific week in the Bahamas sun has not set, it is a world bathed in bright, ambient daylight, a time when the water is clear, when visibility stretches for miles, and when neighboring vessels are actively moving through the harbor. If Lynette Hooker went into the water at 7 o'clock, she did so in plain view of a populated coastline, during an hour when the glass-calm waters would have made a swimming human being visible from hundreds of yards away. Ask yourself why that detail matters so much, and why a husband would later push that timeline forward by a critical 60 minutes to ensure the narrative took place in pitch blackness. A 60-minute discrepancy might seem like a simple mistake made by a traumatized man who had spent 9 grueling hours drifting at sea, but in the sterile environment of a criminal investigation, time is the ultimate arbiter of truth. The shift from 7 to 8 o'clock is not a casual error. It is the difference between a visible, rescuable emergency in the dying embers of daylight and a hopeless, tragic disappearance in the dead of night. Edward Smith's account introduces a profound sense of bewilderment that the investigators themselves are now struggling to reconcile, because the watchman asked the very same question that is likely running through your mind right now. If your wife went into the water at 7 o'clock in the evening, and you are only just walking up to a brightly lit boatyard to seek help at 4 o'clock the following morning, what exactly happened during those 9 missing hours in the dark? The timeline of those 9 hours has always been described by Brian as a heroic, desperate struggle for survival, a narrative of a man stranded without propulsion, drifting helplessly across 4 miles of open water because his wife had the key to the dinghy's motor inside her dry bag. He told rescue teams that he was left with a single oar, paddling frantically against a hostile current that refused to let him reach her, watching her silhouette fade into the distance until he was entirely alone with the sea. But the night watchman's transcript reveals that the narrative Brian offered on land was a living, shifting thing that seemed to morph depending on who was listening. When sitting in the immediate aftermath of the event, cold and exhausted on the boatyard floor, Brian allegedly told the watchman that as the dinghy drifted away in the night, he could still see Lynette, and that she was actively swimming toward Hope Town. This statement, preserved in the watchman's recollection, represents a massive deviation from every single piece of information later provided to the volunteer fire and rescue teams or the federal authorities. To the official search coordinates, Brian indicated that the last time he saw his wife, she was attempting to swim due south, straining to reach the safety of their anchored 46-foot sailboat, the Soulmate. Yet, to the man who first offered him a cup of water, he claimed she was swimming toward Hope Town, a destination that sits in the exact opposite direction, entirely due north of their supposed position. The geography of the sea does not allow for these kinds of errors. A human being cannot be swimming south toward a boat and north toward a town at the exact same time, and a husband desperately trying to guide rescuers to his drowning wife would not confuse the two compass points. This is where the narrative begins to feel heavy with suspicion, not because of wild theories, but because the facts themselves are refusing to sit side by side without creating friction. The introduction of Hope Town as her destination introduces a chaotic element into the search grid that may have actively misdirected the initial, critical hours of the rescue operation. I want to pause here for a moment and ask you to really look at this contradiction, to step into the mindset of an investigator looking at these two maps, and tell me what you think in the comments below. Do you believe it is humanly possible for someone experiencing the ultimate trauma of losing their spouse to completely flip the geography of north and south? Or are we looking at the deliberate obfuscation of a man trying to ensure that search parties were looking in the wrong place entirely? The discrepancies do not stop at the direction of her swim. They extend down to the very objects Lynette was supposedly carrying with her as she fought for her life in the gentle swells of the Bahamian Sea. Brian would later tell fire and rescue personnel that when Lynette went overboard, she vanished with her personal gear, leaving him alone in the craft with nothing but his own belongings. But according to the Watchman, Brian described a scene where Lynette was swimming through the water while actively clutching a yellow dry bag, a detail that immediately set off alarm bells for the investigative journalists tracking the case. Those who know the couple well, and the photographic evidence gathered from their social media profiles in the days leading up to the disappearance, tell a fundamentally different story about the colors of their equipment. Lynette's personal dry bag, the one she took on every excursion, the one that supposedly contained the keys to the boat and her personal items, was a distinctive, vibrant neon green. The yellow dry bag, the one the Watchman explicitly remembers seeing and hearing about, belonged to someone else entirely. It was Brian's bag, an item that should have been securely inside the dinghy or back on the sailboat. When the Watchman noted that Brian himself was carrying a yellow bag when he walked out of the mangroves and onto the concrete lot of the boatyard, the narrative of the missing keys and the lost propulsion began to show its seams. If Brian had the yellow bag, and Lynette had the green bag, why did Brian tell the first human being he encountered that his wife was swimming away with the yellow one? It is a detail that feels almost microscopic, the difference between yellow and green on a dark night, but in true crime investigations, it is precisely these tiny slips of the tongue that begin to unravel a grand deception. The weight of these bad facts, as the legal community often calls them, is beginning to accumulate into a massive pile that no jury could easily ignore, even though Brian Hooker has not been officially charged with a crime at this stage of the investigation. As we look at the shifting colors of the bags, the conflicting directions of the swim, and the hour of daylight that suddenly replaced the midnight storm, the image of a tragic maritime accident begins to fade, replaced by something far more calculated. This changes everything we thought we knew about the husband's credibility, and as we prepare to move deeper into the digital evidence that the Coast Guard has pulled from the depths of their sailboat, the night watchman's words remain hanging in the air, a chilling reminder that the truth always leaves a footprint, even in the middle of the ocean. The concrete of the Marsh Harbor boatyard was still damp with morning dew when the initial rescue vessels began to organize, but as Brian Hooker was transferred from the custody of the night watchman into the hands of the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue Team, the narrative did not settle. It grew stranger by the minute. 4 seasoned rescue volunteers stood on the deck of that search boat, men and women who had spent their entire lives reading the nuances of the ocean and the behavior of those who survive it, and yet, when they looked at the man who had just spent 9 hours supposedly drifting to land, their collective memory fractured in a way that continues to baffle investigators to this day. There is an evolutionary psychology to survival. A person who has spent nearly half a day fighting a maritime current, paddling with a single oar, and watching their spouse drown behaves in a very specific, visceral manner. They are typically hyperventilating, their skin is heavily encrusted with salt crystals, their clothes are often torn or disheveled from the physical exertion, and their focus is entirely consumed by a manic urgency to turn the boats around and head back to the last known coordinates of the disaster. But the transcripts of the rescue personnel paint a picture of a man who seemed to exist in a completely different reality, a reality where the primary concern was not the coordinate grid of the Sea of Abaco, but the physical security of an athletic, blue and white patterned Hawaiian-style shirt and a pair of matching royal blue slide sandals. Think about that for a moment, because when you are standing on the deck of a rescue vessel while your wife is missing in the vast expanse of the ocean, the condition of your footwear is usually the very last thing on your mind. Stay with me here, because this is where the observations of these 4 professional rescuers take an even more complicated turn, introducing an anomaly that has become a central focus for the Coast Guard Investigative Service. As Brian stepped over the gunwale of the rescue boat, 2 of the volunteers noted with absolute certainty that he was carrying a royal blue or aqua-colored dry bag, a piece of gear made from heavy, waterproof fabric used by divers to protect high-end electronics. This observation directly clashed with the night watchman, who had insisted just minutes prior that the bag in Brian's possession was bright yellow. To make matters even more unsettling, a 3rd rescue volunteer distinctly remembers that when they finally ferried Brian back out to his anchored 46-foot sloop, the Soulmate, Brian walked down into the cabin with a local police officer and remained below deck for a full, uninterrupted hour while the search for his missing wife was actively stalling outside. When Brian finally emerged from the belly of the sailboat to rejoin the search efforts, the volunteer noticed something that felt incredibly wrong. Brian had left the aqua dry bag down in the cabin. The rescuer even recalled thinking to himself how bizarre it was for a man to be so incredibly careless with his personal belongings during the absolute worst crisis of his life. Yet, when a 4th rescue representative was questioned months later by federal agents, he completely contradicted his crewmates, stating with absolute conviction that Brian had been holding a yellow bag from the very beginning of the morning. This shifting, kaleidoscopic narrative surrounding the color of a simple plastic bag might seem trivial to an outside observer, but to a trained investigator, it signals a profound logistical problem that cannot be explained away by the fog of war or the trauma of bereavement. If the witnesses on the scene cannot agree on whether the husband was carrying a yellow bag, a blue bag, or an aqua bag, it raises the terrifying possibility that there was more than one piece of luggage moving between the dinghy, the boatyard, and the cabins of the Soulmate that morning. Take a moment to think about this specific detail, and consider the immense friction it creates within the official record. If you believe this case deserves more national attention and want to see how these contradictions unfold in court, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and share this video with others who care about true investigative justice. When you look at the physical reality of the situation, the discrepancies over the bags become even more critical because of what was missing from the equation entirely. Lynette's distinct neon green dry bag, the one that supposedly sank into the ocean depths with the keys to the motor, was nowhere to be found, but her powder pink Apple Watch band, an item she was wearing in a selfie just hours before her disappearance, was later discovered sitting completely dry on a table inside the locked cabin of the Soulmate. The presence of that watch band on board the sailboat is a detail that hits the audience like a physical blow because it completely invalidates the foundational premise of Brian's defense. His entire explanation for why he could not save his wife, why he could not start the engine of the dinghy, and why he was forced to drift helplessly for 9 hours turned on the claim that Lynette went into the ocean while wearing her personal gear, effectively taking the keys and their communication devices into the water with her. If she fell off the back of the dinghy halfway between the shore and the sailboat, as Brian claimed, there is absolutely no mathematical or physical law that would allow her Apple Watch to untie itself from her wrist, travel through the air, bypass the locked hatches of the vessel, and land neatly on a countertop inside the salon of the Soulmate. The physics of the ocean do not lie, and the presence of that pink band indicates with a high degree of certainty that Lynette, or at least the technology she wore on her body, was back on board that 46-foot sloop long after the hour Brian claimed she had vanished into the sea. This is where things get serious, and this is where the investigation transitions from a standard missing persons case into a highly technical, forensic data retrieval operation led by the Coast Guard Investigative Service. Federal agents did not just place crime scene tape around the hull of the Soulmate out of an abundance of caution. They towed the massive vessel 40 miles offshore, bringing it directly to a secure Coast Guard facility in Fort Pierce, Florida, where a team of maritime forensic experts has been reaming the vessel from stem to stern. Every day, agents in white protective suits can be seen walking up and down the boarding ramps, carrying heavily sealed, anti-static evidence bags filled with the boat's internal wiring, battery terminals, and navigational computers. You see, modern sailboats of this size are not just pieces of fiberglass and canvas. They are living, breathing digital ecosystems. Experienced sailors who live aboard vessels like the Soulmate often wire their ships with sophisticated electrical monitoring systems that act as an undeletable black box, recording every single microamp of power consumption, every battery drain, and every single time a water pump or a cabin light is switched on or off in the dark. The federal agents are currently matching those electrical timestamps against the handwritten logs and verbal statements provided by Brian Hooker, and report from internal sources indicate that the results are proving to be extraordinarily productive. If the boat's internal computer shows a sudden surge in electrical use, or the activation of a high-capacity bilge pump at 3 o'clock in the morning, an hour when Brian claimed he was miles away, weeping and paddling a disabled dinghy in the open ocean, the entire alibi evaporates in an instant. This changes everything we thought we knew about the timeline, because it suggests that the true crime scene was never the open water, nor was it the violent, imaginary waves of the Sea of Abaco. The true focus of this mystery is turning rapidly toward the interior of that 1980 Morgan sloop, a confined space where two people went out for a romantic evening in the islands, but only one returned to tell a story that changes shape every single time a new witness opens their mouth. Want to pause here and invite you to drop your theories in the comments below. Knowing that her watch was found dry on the boat, and knowing that federal agents are pulling the electrical logs as we speak, what do you believe really happened below deck while the rest of the world thought they were missing at sea? The ambient warmth of the Florida sun beat down on the industrial docks of Fort Pierce, casting a harsh glare on the yellow crime scene tape that now wrapped around the stainless steel stanchions of the Soulmate. For a vessel built in 1980, the Morgan 46-foot sloop still possessed a classic, stately silhouette, but as federal agents continued their meticulous extraction of its internal components, the romantic allure of the live-aboard lifestyle was entirely replaced by the cold geometry of a homicide investigation. Inside that hull lay the answer to a question that had haunted the Hooker family for over 5 weeks, a question that was no longer centered on the unpredictable currents of the Bahamian Sea, but on the digital breadcrumbs left behind by a husband who believed he was the smartest man in the room. You see, when the Coast Guard Investigative Service began auditing the boat's technological footprint, they were not just looking at the physical structure of the vessel. They were looking at the invisible tether that connected the Soulmate to the global network of communication satellites. Mounted high on the aluminum mast, glinting in the coastal light, was a rectangular Starlink satellite dish, a piece of hardware that would ultimately become the ultimate arbiter of truth in this investigation, acting as a silent, digital sentry that recorded every movement, every connection, and every single handshake between the vessel and the personal devices of its occupants. Think about that for a moment, because in the modern era of true crime, the digital ghost a person leaves behind is often far more vocal than any physical witness standing on a dock. Brian Hooker had confidently asserted to search teams that his small dinghy had been pulled by a merciless tide, drifting thousands of yards away from the parent vessel before the tragedy even unfolded, a distance that would have rendered his personal devices completely isolated from the boat's localized network. He painted a picture of absolute isolation, a man cut off from help, unable to call for rescue or access the internet as he floated through the blackness of the night. But Starlink technology does not operate on human sentimentality or narrative convenience. It operates on precise, unalterable radio frequencies that automatically log every time a recognized smartphone, tablet, or Apple Watch comes within range of its localized Wi-Fi bubble. If the historical data logs extracted from that mast-mounted dish show that Brian's phone or Lynette's electronic devices were actively communicating with the boat's router at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, or 2 o'clock in the morning, the story of a 9-hour drift across the open ocean completely collapses into a calculated fabrication. Stay with me here, because this is where the digital forensic track takes an even more devastating turn for the defense, introducing an entirely new level of suspicion that has left investigators completely stunned. As journalists and federal agents began tracing the origin of the information Brian had been feeding to volunteers during the initial search, they discovered a series of crudely drawn, highly specific drift maps that he had sent via text message to Jim Todd of the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue Service. These maps, which featured neat little cartoon arrows indicating the exact trajectory of his supposed drift path through the islands, had been presented by Brian as the organic product of his maritime knowledge and memory of the wind directions. However, when digital media experts zeroed in on the structural metadata of those images, they realized the graphics were not hand-drawn at all. They were the unmistakable output of an advanced artificial intelligence generator. Brian Hooker, while supposedly sitting in a state of absolute panic and grief over his missing wife, had been using his active Wi-Fi connection to feed prompts into Gemini AI, using the software to construct a visually convincing, fictionalized map of his survival story. This detail hits the audience like a physical blow because it completely changes our understanding of the husband's mindset during those critical, early hours of the investigation. A man who has just lost the love of his life to the sea does not typically spend his time adjusting parameters on an AI interface to ensure his directional arrows look aesthetically pleasing for rescue teams. He screams for help, he coordinates with search grids, and he relies on raw reality to guide the boats to his wife. The revelation that Gemini was his AI of choice has caused a massive shift in the strategy of the Coast Guard Investigative Service, prompting agents to secure emergency federal warrants for Brian's entire Google account history, including every single prompt, search query, and interaction logged on the platform over the last 6 weeks. In the history of criminal justice, we have seen Google searches sink countless defendants, watching their defense strategies disintegrate as prosecutors read their typed queries aloud to a silent courtroom. But the introduction of interactive AI conversations represents a terrifying new frontier in investigative journalism. Ask yourself why that detail matters so much, and consider the chilling possibilities that open up when a husband begins interacting with a responsive digital intelligence in the middle of a suspected crime scene. If Brian Hooker was utilizing Gemini to render deceptive maps to mislead the volunteer rescue teams, it forces us to confront an incredibly uncomfortable question regarding what else that interface might have been used for during the hours when the soulmate went completely dark. Investigators are currently looking into whether the account logs contain queries regarding localized tidal patterns, the depth of remote mangrove creeks, or the physical extraction of items from a standard marine dinghy. This is where things get serious, because if the timestamps on those AI interactions reveal that the prompts were being generated before Brian ever washed up at the Marsh Harbor boatyard, it proves a level of premeditation and narrative planning that completely rules out the possibility of an accidental drowning. The digital footprint does not warp with emotion, nor does it suffer from the memory lapses that plague human witnesses. It simply stands as a cold, binary record of exactly where a man's fingers were doing the walking while his wife was vanishing from the face of the earth. The suspicion building around this technical data is further compounded by the physical evidence that Brian allegedly left behind on his own body, an anomaly that stood out prominently during his subsequent appearances on major television networks. If you watch the clipped interviews circulating on true crime podcasts, where the camera zeroed in for a tight close-up on the husband's hands, you can clearly see a dark, heavy accumulation of dirt tightly embedded beneath his fingernails. For a man who claimed to have spent 9 uninterrupted hours immersed in the pristine, crystal-clear saltwater of Tahiti Beach and the Abaco Pool before drifting for half a day in the open ocean, the presence of that deep-set grime defies every law of basic hygiene and maritime reality. Open ocean water acts as a natural, abrasive solvent. Hours of paddling, swimming, and gripping plastic oars in the sea typically leaves a survivor's skin completely scrubbed clean, free of any terrestrial debris or land-based soil. The presence of that dirt strongly suggests that before Brian ever encountered the night watchman, his hands were actively engaged in intense, manual labor on land, perhaps clawing through the thick, muddy roots of the nearby mangrove swamps or digging into the soft sand of a hidden beach in the dead of night. I want to pause here and invite you to step into the role of the investigator analyzing this collision of digital and physical evidence, and tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe that a man could casually navigate an AI platform to design search maps while genuinely experiencing the trauma of a lost spouse? Or does the combination of the Gemini prompts and the dirt under his fingernails paint a picture of a cover-up executed in real time? The accumulation of these bad facts is beginning to create a heavy, suffocating atmosphere around the defense. And as we prepare to transition into the final, explosive contradictions concerning the physical injuries and the missing flares, the image of the grieving husband continues to fracture into 1,000 unreconstructible pieces. The physical reality of the soulmate sitting under federal lock and key in Fort Pierce is a stark reminder that while the ocean can swallow secrets, it can rarely keep them from a modern forensic team. As the Coast Guard Investigative Service moves into the final phase of their technical audit, the weight of the evidence is shifting from what Brian Hooker said happened to what the physical mechanics of the boat proved did happen. One of the final, most explosive contradictions in the official record centers on the maritime emergency flares that Brian claimed to have deployed while drifting helplessly in his dinghy. He explicitly told the night watchman, Edward Smith, that he had discharged 2 separate flares into the night sky, watching them burn brightly as 2 different vessels passed him by without stopping to render aid. But in the tight-knit community of ocean sailors, a flare is not viewed as a casual piece of fireworks. It is a universal, sacred cry for help, a mayday signal that commands immediate, unquestioned response from any captain within line of sight. When investigators recovered the actual flare gun from the interior of the soulmate, forensic ballistics revealed a detail that instantly compromised Brian's narrative. Only a single flare had been fired from the mechanism, and its chemical residue painted a very different picture of the night's events. Witnesses on the shore, a group of local residents who were looking out across the calm waters near the couple's anchorage that evening, reported seeing a single, lonely flare streak across the horizon, but they noted that it did not originate from the open ocean where a dinghy would be drifting. They testified with absolute certainty that the flare rose directly from the deck of the soulmate itself, fired at a horizontal angle that seemed completely inconsistent with a standard vertical distress signal meant to attract distant search teams. This detail changes everything we thought we knew about the husband's behavior, because it suggests that the only flare ever deployed that night was fired from the safety of the main vessel, long before any drift across the harbor supposedly began. Think about that for a moment, And ask yourself why a man would fire a single, horizontal flare from his own deck and then later claim to have fired multiple distress signals from a disabled dinghy miles away in the dark. It is an observation that introduces a chilling sense of orchestration into the timeline, as if the distress signal was never meant to trigger an actual rescue, but was instead fired to establish a visible, public record of an emergency that had not yet occurred. The accumulation of these bad facts has created a devastating legal landscape for Brian Hooker, even though he remains officially uncharged with a crime while the dual investigations by the Bahamian police and the Coast Guard Investigative Service grind forward. Every single pillar of his original explanation, the 7 o'clock hour of daylight, the changing colors of the dry bags, the pristine Apple Watch left dry on the counter, the Gemini AI prompts used to construct fictional drift trajectories, and the dirt embedded beneath his fingernails, stands in direct, violent opposition to the physical laws of the ocean. The narrative is no longer an open-ended mystery about a tragic maritime accident. It has become a masterclass in how digital technology and precise witness testimony can converge to expose a deception in real time. This story is a powerful reminder of how fragile a constructed alibi becomes when it is subjected to the unrelenting light of investigative journalism and federal forensic science. If you believe that Lynette Hooker deserves a full, uncompromised measure of justice, and you want to ensure that this development continues to receive the national attention it demands, please take a moment right now to share this video, drop your final theories in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel to stay tuned, because this investigation is rapidly approaching its breaking point, and the truth will not stay buried in the dark.